Number 1. Shack. I listen to a lot of scary stories online, and there seem to be a lot of them that take place out in the country. However, most of them seem to be when someone is hiking or walking along a country road. Sometimes it's someone driving down dark country roads. But I grew up out in the country, and you didn't need to go further than your own home or the home of your relatives to encounter something scary. Sometimes the scariest things can happen right from your own house. This happened quite a while ago. I don't remember my age exactly, but I was pretty young, and I am in my 70s now. I know that I was under 10 years old. In the area that I grew up in, which was very, very rural, people spent a lot of time with their families and extended families. And even though my parents and my siblings lived way out in the country, my grandparents lived in a much more rural area than that. I tend to think that if my grandparents were still alive today, and they saw the technology advancements that we had achieved over the years, they would probably have a heart attack. Now, while my grandparents didn't have an actual farm, they did have a garden, and they had some farm animals. They had chickens, dogs, cats, and a goat. I was very used to having goat's milk whenever I was over at their place. The first time one of my kids had goat's milk, and we told her what it was, she ran out of the room crying. But for my age, and where I lived, it was normal. So, what was their house like? It was small. It was a shack, basically. There were a couple rooms, a bedroom for the parents, one for the kids, a kitchen, and a small living room. There was an outhouse in the back, a very small barn for the animals, a chicken coop, and a shed. On one occasion, I remember being over there. My parents had to go on a drive and would be gone for nearly a week, so they took us over there so that my grandparents could watch us. It was just me and my 2 sisters. I have more siblings now, but they were not born yet at the time. I was always a bit scared at night when I was at my grandparents' house. This was for several reasons. First, it was so much darker over there than it was at our place. I mean, it was very dark outside. I haven't really experienced that kind of darkness anywhere since in my entire life, so I avoided getting up in the middle of the night and going over to the outhouse, because that was an absolutely terrifying experience. Another reason I was scared was because of the shack itself. It had extremely thin walls, just boards to be honest, and it seemed like it was something dangerous. The monsters that I believed in back when I was young, or the scary people who might want to hurt me, wouldn't have too much of a problem getting into the shack, so that was really terrifying. My grandparents, being old at the time, absolutely went to bed earlier than the kids did, or more accurately, went to sleep. We had to be in bed then too, but we wouldn't fall asleep as early as they did. We would stay up and talk, and then eventually fall asleep. Well, this night was a bit scarier than most also. It was very, very windy outside. Of course, the shack gave no insulation from the wind and weather. The 3 of us were all curled up on the one bed together, listening to the wind hitting the walls of the building. And believe me, the wind shook the shack quite a bit. We were all laying there in the feather bed under a quilt, and we were all scared. But at least we were all together, so that made it easier. The wind was scary, and it was keeping us from going to sleep. And then I heard something, and I couldn't tell what it was from the sound of the wind being stronger than it. But it was a sound that seemed like it didn't belong. While the wind kept shaking the house, I heard it again, and I recognized it the second time. I asked my sisters, "Do you hear the goat bleeding?" They hadn't, but after a while, listening, they both eventually heard it. I don't know if you know much about goats, but they do not tend to bleed at nighttime. And this goat sounded distressed about something, and that just made us kids even more scared. I mean, you know how the imagination of children can be pretty intense to begin with. We were scared enough just with the violence of the wind that the bleating of a distressed goat only made everything that much more elevated. We thought that if we heard the goat bleating, and eventually the chickens clucking in distress, that possibly our grandparents would hear it too. And after a while that seemed to be the case. We heard our grandfather get up and heard him walking around. After a few moments we heard the door to the shack open and close. Over the wind, we were able to hear our grandpa arguing with someone, but we couldn't make out who he was arguing with or what they were talking about. And after a while, we heard our grandpa scream, and then heard what sounded like a shotgun blast. When we were terrified, but we didn't know what to do. We just held each other in bed. Our grandma went outside and she was pretty hysterical. She brought our grandpa into the house. At no time did they come in and talk to us, but we hadn't expected them to. We did find out later what happened when they told our mom. A neighbor had come over and was trying to steal chickens in the middle of the night. My grandpa confronted him, got stabbed, and shot after the guy who fled. Fortunately, my grandpa didn't die or anything like that. My sisters and I were so scared, and it was a terrifying night that we have never forgot. Number 2. Ride. This is sort of a lesson that you should probably listen to people who warn you against doing certain things. My family is from the southern Ohio area, and in fact I have so many cousins and such that I don't even know all of them. It seems like I'm always being introduced to some new cousin that I didn't know I had. Although I don't live in that area, we do go there every year for Easter. And this year, it was just me and my mom who went, and it was to visit her parents. We took my car, which was a first, because I had never made a long drive in my car like that before, and I was more than ready to do it for the first time. Still, my mom ended up doing most of the driving, but the good thing was that I didn't feel like I was restricted to being home all the time by myself. On one of the first days I was there, we were in the town of Ironton. We stopped at a gas station there, and there was a guy that I had never met before. My mom was talking to him, and he was asking for a ride. I could tell right away that my mom was not comfortable with the idea of giving this guy a ride. I heard her tell him that we were not going to go all the way to his destination, as we were crossing the bridge and going into Kentucky. He was off to the town of South Point, which was in Ohio, so we at least gave him a ride to the bridge. My mom was driving and he sat beside me. He was a second cousin of my mom's, and I will call him Tom. I don't know exactly what that makes him to me, but he was obviously drunk or high or something. After we dropped him off, my mom told me not to mention it to my grandma when we got home. Like a lot of our relatives, he was a heavy drug user who had spent time in jail and things like that. Basically, she didn't even want to give him the short ride to the bridge either, but she had a hard time saying no. A few days later, I was getting bored of being there. All my relatives do is sit and talk about the same memories over and over again, so I decided to go out at night. I went to get something to drink, and I had to cross over into Ohio because the Kentucky county there was a dry county. When I was at the liquor store, that guy Tom was hanging out there as well. I tried not to pay much attention to him, but he kept looking at me, and it took him a few moments, but after that few moments, he obviously recognized me. At that point, he began talking to me. I could tell where it was going, too. He was talking about how he had been out partying with some friends, much like he had the previous time that I'd seen him, and he had gotten himself stranded again. So I knew it would lead around to him asking me for a ride at some point. And like my mom, I really wasn't the best at telling someone no. But I also realized that I had been bored, so maybe a nice ride out in that area, which I didn't know very well, would be exactly what I need. I had never driven down there at all, and I'd actually lived in South Point when I was 14, so I thought it might be nice to drive there. So I decided to give him a ride. Honestly, I did feel slightly uncomfortable with the guy. He seemed nice enough, but he was either drunk or stoned or something, and I really couldn't tell which. I assumed that he lived in town, but instead he had me take a side road that led into the hills of the area. I then figured he may have lived out in the country, as it was likely cheaper for him to do so, although it did make me wonder how he kept getting into town. He had me take a road that took me up onto a hill. I was nervous for several reasons. It was dark. The road was extremely narrow, and I'd never driven in such an area before. When we eventually arrived to the place I was taking him to, it was an old and dilapidated trailer sitting in a lot off the road. He thanked me for the ride and got out of the car. I had this thing that when I give a ride to someone, I like to remain behind and watch them go into the house, so I did that. Tom got into the trailer and closed the door, so then I started to back up. I was looking over my shoulder going out of the driveway, and suddenly there was a huge bang and a scream. My eyes shot forward to look at the trailer. Tom was lying on the ground in front of the trailer. Standing over him was a woman, and in her hand she was holding a knife. She was advancing on him. At first I didn't know what to do. This was such a bizarre thing to see. However, I also knew that I needed to do something, or I might be witnessing a death. The woman descended on Tom. I reached under the seat of my car and grabbed the cross. I used to change tires. Yeah, it's a weird weapon, I admit, but it was the only thing I had. I went toward the woman who stabbed Tom with a knife. She looked up at me and saw me advancing on her, and she quit stabbing Tom and got up, locking herself back in the trailer. I helped Tom up and helped him into my car. I had to get him to a hospital. I tried talking to him along the way, but he was pretty messed up, and I was scared driving up that hill to the trailer. But that was nothing like how scared I was going to the hospital. Fortunately, though, I got him there in time. I guess the lady who owned the trailer was his girlfriend. She was pissed at him for coming home one time too many late, so she attacked him. I had a lot of fun explaining what happened to my mom later on. Number 3. Walk. I was bullied really bad when I was growing up. I grew up in a really rural area. Often when I tell my friends about what I had to go through when I was younger, they are generally quite shocked. They can't believe that any school or place would allow a kid to be as blatantly picked on as I was. I was constantly being forced into fights, and I didn't like fighting, so I would often just not engage. And of course, everyone assumed this meant I was chicken, so that made the bullying even worse. But I really wasn't scared as much as I was just not the type of person who got anything out of fighting. But anyway, I didn't care a lot of the time. I lived far from the school, and really far from the other students, out in the country. The closest people to me were an elderly couple, and it took at least 30 minutes worth of walking to get to their house. I would go a lot too, because they would give me cookies and things, and also I liked talking to them a lot. I could listen to old people tell me stories all day. During the summertime, I spent quite a bit of time over at their home. I got to hear a great bunch of stories. A few nights, since they are not the type of seniors who always go to bed early, I stayed out pretty late in the night, listening to them talk. When I left and would make the walk home, which I mentioned was at least a half-hour walk, my parents had long been in bed by that time. And so it happened that one night I had a pretty scary encounter. I was at the house of the seniors. Hell, I could still taste the great cookies that the lady of the house made for me, but I was there pretty late and we all lost track of time. The husband was a war veteran, and when he began talking about those stories, he absolutely would go on and on. Not that I minded, of course. After they went to bed, I set out to walk home. I was still a bit restless at the time, though, and wasn't looking forward to going home and sleeping, so I decided to sort of circle around and take the longer way to get home. It was a beautiful night. It was very hot out, but there was a cool breeze. The moon was out, and the cloud cover was minimal, so I could see a lot of stars in the sky. And then, looking off in the distance, I saw a little red light. It was very small, and it was very faint and a bit up the road from me. I didn't know what it was, and I wasn't really concerned about it, but I was curious. The light moved a little bit, quick and flickering movements, and as I walked closer and closer in its direction, it walked closer and closer in my direction. But it was when it looked like it was tossed on the side of the road that I realized it was a cigarette, and someone was out walking towards me. And when they got closer, I noticed that they were kids from school that I knew, and they were kids from school who bullied me. I wasn't able to get away, though, without them noticing me, and when they did, they began laughing and calling me names. I tried to walk past them and ignore them, but one of them tripped me and I landed on my face. I tried to get up, and when I did, I looked back at the guys. One of them took out a pocket knife and slowly opened the blade, grinning at me. I jumped to my feet and I quickly went running down the road. They chased me for a little while without catching me. I wasn't sure they were really trying. They were probably just trying to frighten me, and it worked. When I finally quit running, I turned around, and they were standing off in the distance. One of them yelled, "It'll be waiting for you at school." It was a scary thing to think about for the rest of the summer. I was scared that something bad would happen to me when I went back to school, and I dreaded it. But I also dreaded going outside because I kept thinking I would run into them again. They never hurt me with a knife, but the fear they caused was quite real. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.